My name is Emma, and I've been invisible my entire life. Not the literal kind, but the type that happens when you're the disappointment in a family of golden children. The kind where you could set yourself on fire at the dinner table, and someone would just ask you to pass the salt. Tonight was supposed to be different. I had something important to share, the kind of announcement that might finally make them notice me. But as I sat at our mahogany dining table watching my mother hang on Jake's every word about his latest promotion, that familiar feeling crept back in. "So the partners called me into the conference room," Jake was saying, cutting his steak with surgical precision. My brother was all sharp edges and perfect lines. Even the way he held his fork looked like performance art. And I thought I was in trouble. But then Harrison says, "Congratulations, you made partner." Mom practically glowed. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. Richard, did you hear? Jake made partner." Dad looked up from his phone long enough to nod approvingly. "Knew you had it in you, son. Youngest partner in the firm's history." "Actually, second youngest," Jake corrected with false modesty. But close enough. I took a deep breath. This was my moment. "That's amazing, Jake. Actually, I have some important news, too. I got accepted into—" "Emma, please," Mom interrupted without even looking at me. "We're celebrating your brother. But this is really important. You're nobody," she said, finally turning those cold blue eyes on me. "Stop pretending you matter in this family." The words hit like a physical blow. 23 years of this, and it still took my breath away. But Jake wasn't done. "Honestly, half the time we forget you even exist," he added with that smirk I'd seen since childhood. What could you possibly have to say that's more important than this? Something inside me finally snapped. The weight of the secret I'd carried for 3 years became unbearable. The exhaustion from trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it overwhelmed me. I was just tired of being nobody. I picked up my fork and tapped it gently against my wine glass. The crystal sang out clear and sharp, cutting through their self-congratulatory laughter. The room went completely silent. "Dad embezzled $200,000 from the Morrison family's wrongful death settlement," I said quietly. "Jake knew about it and helped cover it up. Mrs. Morrison's daughter couldn't afford college because you stole her dead father's money." The silence was deafening. Mom's face drained of all color. Dad's phone clattered to the floor. Jake sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like he'd forgotten how to speak. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Enjoy celebrating your success built on stolen money." I walked out of that dining room and didn't look back. Behind me, I heard Mom start to hyperventilate and Dad's voice, shaky for the first time in my life, calling my name. But I kept walking. Because for the first time ever, I wasn't invisible. I drove through the rain for 20 minutes before I realized I had nowhere to go. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and every red light gave me time to think about what I'd just done. What I'd just destroyed with 3 sentences that had been burning inside me for 3 years. The secret had been eating me alive since the day I found those documents at Dad's law firm. I was 20, working unpaid as his summer intern, which really meant filing papers and fetching coffee for the real staff. I'd been organizing client settlements when I noticed the Morrison file was thicker than the others. Curious, I opened it. The original settlement should have been $800,000. The documented amount was $600,000. Someone had skimmed $200,000 right off the top of a grieving family's compensation. My father's signature was on every page. I remember sitting in that sterile office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, staring at the proof that my dad was a thief. Mrs. Morrison's husband had died in a construction accident, leaving her with 3 kids and a mountain of debt. I'd seen her at the office once, clutching tissues while Dad explained the settlement terms with his practiced sympathetic voice. The worst part wasn't discovering my father was a criminal. It was realizing that Jake knew about it. I found the email chain buried in Dad's computer files. Jake and Dad discussing how to restructure the Morrison payment and ensure discretionary fund allocation. Legal jargon for stealing from a widow and her children. When I confronted Jake that night, he was calm as always. We stood in his pristine apartment, everything exactly where it should be, while he explained why I needed to stay quiet. "Think about Mom," he'd said, pouring himself whiskey like we were discussing the weather. "You know her heart condition. This kind of stress could literally kill her. And Dad's other clients, Emma. Good people who depend on him. You want to destroy all their cases because of one mistake. One mistake? I'd whispered. Jake, it's theft. It's fraud. It's complicated, he replied. The Morrison case had cost overruns. Dad borrowed from their settlement to cover expenses for other clients. He was going to pay it back. But I'd seen the bank records. Dad bought Mom a new Mercedes that same month. Jake got his down payment for his condo. I got told there wasn't enough money for my graduate school applications. For 3 years, I carried this poison inside me. I watched the Morrison family struggle while mine thrived on stolen money. Mrs. Morrison took a third job to keep her house. Her daughter Sarah worked 2 part-time jobs to pay for community college instead of the university she dreamed of attending. I tried to help anonymously. I sent cash in unmarked envelopes, pretending to be a charity. I paid Sarah's books and fees using my own savings from my part-time job. But it was never enough, and I was drowning in guilt every single day. The irony was that staying silent turned me into their accomplice. Every family dinner where Dad talked about his successful practice, every time Jake bragged about his career climbing the same corrupt ladder, I enabled them with my silence. I became the family secret keeper, protecting criminals because I was too afraid to be the one who brought everything down. Tonight, when Mom called me nobody, and Jake said they forgot I existed, something snapped. 3 years of being invisible while carrying their heaviest burden had finally broken me. If I was nobody to them, then I had nothing left to lose. My phone buzzed again. 12 missed calls from Mom, 8 from Dad, 15 text messages from Jake ranging from angry to desperate to threatening. I turned off the phone and kept driving through the rain. For the first time in 3 years, the weight in my chest felt lighter. I'd finally stopped protecting people who had never protected me. The studio apartment I found was barely bigger than Jake's walk-in closet, but it was mine. 2,400 square feet of freedom that smelled like old carpet and fresh paint. The previous tenant had left behind a single folding chair and a coffee-stained futon that I was grateful to have. I'd been living here for 2 weeks, sleeping on that lumpy futon and eating cereal for dinner, when I realized I was happier than I'd been in years. No one was telling me I didn't matter. No one was forgetting I existed. The silence was peaceful, instead of suffocating. My new job at Riverside Medical Center wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Night security meant long shifts walking empty hallways, checking doors, and monitoring cameras. Most people would find it lonely. For me, it was perfect. After 23 years of being invisible in a crowded house, being alone felt like luxury. It was during my 2nd week that I met Marcus. I was eating a sad sandwich from the vending machine in the break room at 3 a.m. when the day shift supervisor walked in. He was tall, maybe 30, with tired eyes, and the kind of careful movements that suggested he'd learned to navigate the world gently. "You must be Emma," he said, extending his hand. "Marcus Williams. I run the day shift." His handshake was firm but brief, professional. "Hope you're settling in okay? Night shift can be rough if you're not used to it." "I like the quiet," I said honestly. Something in his expression shifted, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, I get that. Quiet's underrated." Over the following weeks, we developed a routine. Marcus would arrive 30 minutes early for his shift, and I'd stay 30 minutes late. We'd sit in that fluorescent-lit break room, sharing terrible coffee and the kind of conversation that happens when you're both too tired to pretend. He told me he used to be an EMT before switching to security. I told him I was taking a break from family expectations. Neither of us pushed for details, which made it easier to be honest about the surface stuff. "You ever miss it?" I asked one morning, watching him add his 3rd packet of sugar to coffee that probably didn't deserve the effort. "Being an EMT?" "Sometimes," he said quietly. "Helping people, making a difference. But the job takes pieces of you after a while. Had to step back before there wasn't anything left." I understood that feeling more than I could explain. Marcus had this way of noticing things without making you feel observed. He'd bring an extra sandwich when he saw me surviving on vending machine food. He'd check the security footage to make sure I wasn't walking rounds alone in isolated areas. Small kindnesses that felt enormous after years of emotional neglect. Meanwhile, my family's perfect world was cracking apart exactly as I'd expected. The local newspaper ran a story about the investigation into Dad's practice. Prominent attorney under review for client fund irregularities. My phone buzzed constantly with calls I didn't answer, and texts that grew increasingly desperate. Jake's messages started angry. "Fix this now or I'll destroy you." Then shifted to bargaining. "We can work this out. Family sticks together." Finally landing on manipulation. "Mom's in the hospital, chest pains. This is your fault." I deleted each message without responding. But they still ate at me. 23 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. Every text triggered that familiar guilt, the automatic response to put their needs before my truth. It was Marcus who noticed me spiraling. "You look like someone who hasn't been sleeping," he said during one of our coffee meetings. "Want to talk about it?" I almost said no, almost deflected with a joke or changed the subject, but something about the way he asked without pressure or expectation made me want to be honest. "My family's going through something," I said carefully, "and they think it's my fault." "Is it?" The question was so direct it caught me off guard. I don't know anymore. Maybe. "Does it matter if doing the right thing hurts people?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Depends on whether the people getting hurt are the ones who created the problem in the first place." His words hit something deep inside me. For the first time since leaving that dinner table, someone wasn't telling me I was wrong for speaking up. Someone wasn't trying to convince me that protecting others was more important than protecting myself. "It's complicated," I said finally. "Most important things are," Marcus replied. "But complicated doesn't mean you were wrong." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. And when my phone buzzed with another guilt-laden message from Jake, I turned it face down and let myself enjoy the quiet. 3 weeks into our coffee routine, I learned that Marcus carried his own shadows. We were sitting in our usual spot when he mentioned his brother almost casually, like testing whether the words would break if spoken out loud. "I had a younger brother," he said, stirring sugar into coffee that was already too sweet. "Danny. He was 16 when he died in a car accident. I was supposed to pick him up from soccer practice that day, but I got held up at work." I set down my cup carefully. "Marcus, I'm sorry. EMT training teaches you that you can't save everyone," he continued, his voice steady but distant. "But knowing something and believing it are different things." Every call after that, I was trying to save Danny all over again. It explained so much about him. The way he checked on me during my rounds. How he always made sure I had everything I needed. The gentle protectiveness that felt caring instead of controlling. "Is that why you left?" I asked. "Burnout," they called it. But really, I was drowning. Couldn't separate my job from my guilt anymore. Every person I couldn't help became another failure. I understood that weight. The crushing responsibility for outcomes beyond your control. "Do you regret leaving?" "Some days. But this job lets me help people without carrying their emergencies home with me. Most days, anyway." Our friendship deepened after that conversation. Marcus shared stories about Danny, and I found myself talking about my family in ways that didn't feel like betrayal. Neither of us pushed for more than the other could give, which made it safe to be vulnerable in small doses. That safety was exactly what made Jake's appearance so jarring. It was a Thursday evening, nearly time for shift change, when I saw him through the security monitors. My brother stood in the medical center lobby wearing his expensive suit, and that determined expression I knew meant trouble. He was talking to the receptionist, probably charming her into telling him where to find me. My hands started shaking as I watched him navigate toward the security office. 3 weeks of peace, and he was already hunting me down. Marcus arrived early as usual, and immediately noticed my distress. "Emma, what's wrong?" "My brother," I said, pointing at the monitor. "He's here. You want me to handle it?" The offer was tempting, but I knew Jake would just keep coming back until he got what he wanted. "No, I need to deal with this myself." Jake found me in the break room 5 minutes later. He looked older than I remembered. Stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at dinner. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. "Emma, thank God," he said, rushing forward like he planned to hug me. I stepped back instinctively. We need to talk. This whole situation is spiraling out of control. What situation? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. Don't play dumb. The state bar opened an investigation. Dad could lose his license. Our family practice could be destroyed. And for what? One accounting error from years ago? Accounting error? The words came out sharper than I intended. Jake, you helped him steal money from a widow. We were going to pay it back, he said, his voice rising. It was a temporary loan. Dad was covering expenses for other clients, and the Morrison settlement was just sitting there. For 3 years, things got complicated, but we had a plan. I stared at my brother, this person I'd looked up to my entire childhood, and realized he actually believed his own lies. Do you hear yourself right now? You're talking about stolen money like it's a business strategy. You're being dramatic. This is how law firms operate. Sometimes funds get shifted around temporarily. It's not theft. It's cash flow management. The rationalization was breathtaking. Mrs. Morrison's daughter couldn't afford college because of your cash flow management. That's not our fault. We didn't force her to make poor financial decisions. I felt Marcus appear in the doorway behind me, his presence solid and reassuring. Jake noticed him too, his expression shifting to practice charm. You must be a colleague of Emma's, Jake said, extending his hand. Jake Chen, her brother. Marcus didn't take the offered handshake. I heard raised voices. Everything okay here, Emma? The question was directed at me, not Jake, which surprised my brother. In our family, men talked to men while women waited their turn. We're just having a family discussion, Jake said, his smile tightening. Emma's going through a difficult phase right now, making some poor choices that are affecting a lot of people. Sounds like she's making brave choices, Marcus replied calmly. Jake's facade cracked slightly. I'm sorry. Who are you exactly? This is a private family matter. I'm someone who knows Emma well enough to recognize she doesn't need fixing, Marcus said. Maybe the problem isn't her choices. The room went silent. Jake looked between Marcus and me, calculating something behind his eyes. Emma, can we please talk privately? 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I looked at Marcus, who nodded slightly. I'll be right outside, he said, making it clear the choice was mine, but I wouldn't be alone. After Marcus left, Jake's mask dropped completely. Who is this guy, Emma? Some security guard who thinks he knows our family. He's a friend. Something you've never been. That's not fair. I've always looked out for you. By making me keep your secrets? By letting me carry guilt that should have been yours? Jake sat down heavily in the plastic chair. For the first time in my life, my perfect brother looked defeated. Emma, I know we haven't always treated you right, but if this investigation continues, it destroys everything. Dad loses his practice, I lose my career, Mom loses her stability. Is that really what you want? Looking at him sitting there, I realized something important. Jake wasn't asking me to forgive them. He wasn't promising things would change. He was asking me to go back to being invisible so they could continue being who they'd always been. Yes, I said quietly. If that's what justice costs, then yes. The devastation on his face was real, and for a moment my old programming kicked in. The urge to comfort him, to take back my words, to make everything okay again. But then I remembered Mrs. Morrison taking 3 jobs to keep her house. I can't help you anymore, Jake. I walked out of that break room and didn't look back. Marcus was waiting in the hallway, exactly where he'd promised to be. You okay? He asked. Getting there, I said. And for the first time, I meant it. 2 months after that dinner, the consequences of my revelation were everywhere I looked. Mrs. Morrison's face stared back at me from the local newspaper's front page under the headline, Widow Attempts Suicide After Financial Fraud Discovered. The article was clinical, factual, devastating. She'd tried to overdose on sleeping pills after losing her house to foreclosure. The reporter had connected her case to Dad's investigation, and suddenly, my family's crime had a human face attached to it. A real victim with a name, 3 children, and a hospital bed. I sat in my studio apartment reading the article over and over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. This was my fault. Not the theft, but the timing. If I'd spoken up 3 years ago when I first discovered the fraud, maybe Mrs. Morrison wouldn't have spent years struggling. Maybe she wouldn't have reached this breaking point. Marcus found me there when I missed my shift, still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by crumpled tissues and empty coffee cups. I'd given him my spare key weeks earlier when he'd worried about me walking home alone after particularly difficult nights. "Emma?" His voice was gentle but concerned. "You weren't answering your phone." I handed him the newspaper without speaking. Watched his face change as he read the article, understanding dawning in his eyes. "This is about your family situation," he said. It wasn't a question. "Her name is Patricia Morrison. She has 3 kids. Sarah, the daughter I told you about, is 21. There's also Michael, who's 17, and little Amy, who's only 12. My voice sounded hollow even to myself. "Patricia tried to kill herself because my father stole her dead husband's money." Marcus sat down on the futon beside me, careful not to crowd my space. "Emma, you didn't steal anything. But I knew about it. For 3 years I knew, and I did nothing while she suffered. You were 20 years old carrying an impossible burden. Your family manipulated you into staying silent. I could have gone to the police, the state bar, anyone, and you'd have been another victim of their abuse. They conditioned you to prioritize their well-being over justice. I wanted to believe him, but the guilt was suffocating. She's in the hospital because I waited too long to do the right thing." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing something. "Can I tell you about the worst call I ever responded to as an EMT?" I nodded, grateful for any distraction from my spiraling thoughts. Family car accident. Father fell asleep driving home from vacation. Mother died instantly. 2 kids seriously injured. The father survived with minor injuries. Marcus's voice was steady, but I could hear the old pain underneath. He spent months blaming himself. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Know what his therapist finally told him? "What? That guilt is often just grief wearing a disguise. We blame ourselves because accepting that some things are beyond our control is too terrifying." The words hit deeper than I expected. "So, Patricia Morrison's suicide attempt isn't my fault?" "Patricia Morrison's suicide attempt is the result of 3 years of financial abuse by people who chose to steal from a vulnerable widow. You were their victim too, Emma. The fact that you finally found the courage to speak up doesn't make you responsible for everything that happened before." I let myself cry then. Really cry. For the first time since leaving home. Marcus didn't try to fix it or make it stop. He just sat with me while I grieved for Patricia Morrison, for her children, for the years I'd lost protecting people who'd never protected me. My phone buzzed constantly during those hours. More messages from my family, but also calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten my number. The story was growing bigger than just Dad's practice. The state bar investigation had uncovered other questionable settlements, and suddenly my father was facing potential criminal charges. "Local attorney under federal investigation for wire fraud," read the evening news ticker that scrolled across my phone. Jake's firm had suspended him pending their own internal investigation. Mom had been photographed leaving the courthouse looking devastated and aged. Part of me felt vindicated. They were finally facing consequences for their actions. But another part, the part that had been trained to care for them above all else, felt sick watching their world collapse. "It's okay to feel conflicted," Marcus said when I confessed this to him. "Wanting justice doesn't mean you stop loving them. It just means you've learned to love yourself too." That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I visited Patricia Morrison at the hospital. She was awake, sitting up in bed and looking fragile but determined. When I introduced myself as the person who'd reported the fraud, her reaction surprised me. "Thank you," she said simply. "I know that must have been difficult. I should have done it sooner. Years sooner." She studied my face for a long moment. "How old were you when you found out?" 20. "And it was your father?" I nodded. Patricia reached over and squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Honey, you were barely more than a child yourself. Don't you dare carry guilt for something they did to both of us." Walking out of that hospital, I felt something shift inside me. The weight in my chest wasn't gone, but it was different somehow. Lighter. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't carrying my family's shame alone. Patricia Morrison had forgiven me for something that was never my fault to begin with. Now I needed to learn to forgive myself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered to my apartment building. Cream-colored stationery with my mother's perfect handwriting, the kind she used for thank you notes and charity correspondence. My name written across the envelope in elegant script, as if this were a social invitation. I almost threw it away unopened. "Dearest Emma," it began, and I could hear her voice in every carefully chosen word. "I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about our last conversation and realized there are things I should have said differently. The manipulation was masterful, subtle in ways that took me years to recognize." She apologized for harsh words spoken in the heat of emotion, while simultaneously explaining how my accusations had devastated the family. She mentioned Dad's sleepless nights and Jake's struggling career, painting them as victims of my misunderstanding about complicated business practices. "I know you believe you're doing the right thing," she wrote, "but sometimes the right thing causes more harm than good. Your father made mistakes, yes, but destroying our family won't help the people you think you're protecting." By the end of the letter, I was second-guessing everything. Maybe I had misunderstood the legal documents. Maybe there was context I'd missed. Maybe I really was destroying innocent people over a complicated situation I was too young to fully grasp. The familiar guilt crept back in, that automatic response that had been programmed into me since childhood. I found myself pacing my tiny apartment, arguing with myself, feeling the old responsibility to fix everything settling back onto my shoulders like a heavy coat. Marcus noticed the change immediately when I arrived at work that evening. I was quieter than usual, distracted during our coffee routine, jumping at small sounds. "You seem on edge tonight," he said gently. "Everything okay?" I handed him the letter without explanation, watching his face as he read. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at me with something between concern and frustration. "Emma, this is textbook emotional manipulation." "Is it, though? Maybe she has a point about—" "Stop." His voice was firmer than I'd ever heard it. "Listen to what you just said. You're defending someone who spent years making you feel invisible, and now you're questioning your own reality because she wrote you a pretty letter. But what if I did misunderstand? What if the legal stuff was more complicated than I realized?" Marcus ran his hands through his hair. A gesture I'd learned meant he was trying to control his frustration. "Emma, you saw the bank records. You saw where that money went. Your father bought luxury items with stolen funds, while a widow worked 3 jobs. Maybe there's context I missed. There's no context that makes theft okay." His voice was gentle but absolute. "And there's no context that makes what they did to you acceptable." I wanted to believe him, but 23 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. "They're still my family." "So was mine," Marcus said quietly. "My father was an alcoholic who terrorized my mother for 15 years. When she finally left him, half the family turned against her for breaking up the home. They made her feel guilty for protecting herself and us kids. I'd never heard him talk about his father before. What happened? She chose herself over their comfort. It was the hardest thing she ever did, and the best thing that ever happened to our family." He reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones hurting you most." That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice reciting the letter, reminding me of my duty to family, my responsibility to protect them from the consequences of their own actions. By morning, I'd convinced myself to call home. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice carefully modulated between relief and reproach. "Emma, sweetheart, I was hoping you'd received my letter." "I did, and I've been thinking." "Oh, good. I knew once you had time to process everything rationally, you'd understand how complicated this situation really is." Something in her tone triggered a memory. I was 8 years old, standing in our kitchen after Jake had pushed me down the stairs and broken my wrist. Mom had used that same voice to explain why I shouldn't tell the doctor what really happened. "Accidents happen, sweetheart, but we don't want to worry people unnecessarily." The spell broke. "Mom," I said clearly, "I understand the situation perfectly. Dad stole money from a grieving family. Jake helped cover it up. And you've all spent 3 years gaslighting me into protecting you from the consequences." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "Emma," she said finally, her careful tone slipping into something colder, "if you continue down this path, there won't be a family left for you to come back to." "Good," I said, and meant it, because what we had wasn't a family anyway. I hung up the phone and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The guilt was still there, but it felt different now, smaller, like something I could carry instead of something that carried me. When Marcus arrived for his shift that evening, I was already in the break room with 2 cups of coffee and a genuine smile. "How are you feeling?" he asked carefully. "Free," I said, and for the first time in months it was completely true. 6 months after walking away from that dinner table, I barely recognized my own life. The changes had crept up slowly, like spring, arriving after a harsh winter. One day I looked around and realized I was actually living instead of just surviving. Work had become more than just a paycheck. I'd been promoted to lead night security, which meant training new employees and coordinating with different departments. Turns out I was good at de-escalating tense situations and making people feel heard. Who would have thought that years of managing family dysfunction had given me useful skills? Dr. Martinez in the psychiatric wing noticed my natural ability with agitated patients and suggested I consider social work. "You have a gift for making people feel safe," she told me, after watching me calm down a confused elderly man who'd been trying to leave the building at 2 a.m. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. I'd never been encouraged to pursue my own interests, never been told I had gifts worth developing, but I found myself researching graduate programs during my breaks, imagining a future where I helped people navigate crisis instead of just carrying other people's secrets. My relationship with Marcus had evolved too, though not in the direction I'd expected. The friendship that started over terrible coffee had deepened into something that felt like chosen family. We looked out for each other without keeping score, shared our worst days without judgment, and celebrated small victories like they mattered. But Marcus carried his own complications. His need to protect people sometimes crossed into controlling territory, and I was learning to recognize the difference between support and rescue. When he tried to convince me not to apply for school because it would be too stressful, I called him out on it. "This sounds familiar," I'd said during one of our conversations. Someone deciding what's too much for me to handle. He'd looked stung, but thoughtful. "You're right. I'm sorry. Sometimes I forget that caring about someone doesn't mean making their decisions." That ability to have difficult conversations and work through them felt revolutionary after years of walking on eggshells. We were both learning what healthy relationships actually looked like. The hardest part wasn't moving forward. It was dealing with the random waves of grief that still caught me off guard. I'd smell someone's perfume that reminded me of Mom, or see a father and son laughing together. And suddenly I'd be overwhelmed by the loss of what my family never was. My therapist, Dr. Chen, helped me understand that grieving a living family was normal. "You're mourning the parents you deserve to have," she explained. "That's not the same as missing the parents you actually had." The sessions were expensive, paid for with overtime shifts and careful budgeting, but they were worth every penny. For the first time in my life, I had someone whose job was to listen to me, believe me, and help me heal. No agenda, no manipulation, just space to figure out who I was when I wasn't busy managing everyone else's emotions. One evening, as Marcus and I sat in our usual break room spot, he brought up something that had been on both our minds. "The state bar hearing is next month," he said carefully. "You going to testify?" I'd been avoiding thinking about it, but the subpoena sat on my kitchen counter like a daily reminder. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I've done enough damage." "Emma," his voice was gentle but firm, "speaking truth isn't damage. It's accountability. I know that intellectually. But actually sitting in a room, looking at my father while I destroy what's left of his career," I trailed off, surprised by how much the thought still hurt. "What do you think Patricia Morrison would say?" That was the question that mattered. Mrs. Morrison had been released from the hospital and was slowly rebuilding her life with the help of victim services. Her daughter Sarah was finally able to transfer to a 4-year university using funds from the restitution account. They'd both sent me thank you cards that I kept pinned to my refrigerator as reminders of why speaking up had mattered. She'd say I should finish what I started, I admitted. Then trust yourself. You've got good instincts when you listen to them. Looking across that table at Marcus, I realized how much my world had expanded since leaving my family behind. I had a friend who challenged me to be better, a job that utilized my strengths, and therapist helping me heal. Most importantly, I had space to discover who I was when I wasn't busy being invisible. The scared 23-year-old who'd tapped her fork against that wine glass was still part of me, but she wasn't in charge anymore. The woman sitting in this break room was stronger, clearer, and finally ready to finish what she'd started. I'll testify, I said, and meant it. The state bar hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and institutional furniture that squeaked when you shifted weight. I sat in the witness section, hands folded in my lap, watching my father's legal team arrange papers with military precision. Dad looked older than his 62 years. His hair had gone completely gray, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost. When his eyes met mine across the room, I saw something I'd never seen before: fear. Jake sat behind the defense table, no longer the confident partner, but a suspended attorney facing his own disciplinary hearing. He avoided looking at me entirely, focusing instead on his phone like the most important messages in the world were arriving every 30 seconds. Mom hadn't come. According to Jake's texts, she was too emotionally fragile to attend. The truth was simpler. She couldn't maintain her victim narrative while watching me testify about her husband's crimes. When they called my name, I walked to the witness stand on steady legs. The oath felt significant, my voice clear as I promised to tell the truth. After years of keeping secrets, honesty felt like oxygen. The prosecutor was a woman about my age named Sarah Kim, who'd done her homework. She walked me through discovering the altered documents, finding the email chains, and confronting my family. Her questions were direct, but not aggressive, allowing me to tell the story in my own words. Ms. Chen, did anyone in your family ask you to remain silent about what you discovered? Yes. My brother Jake explained that exposing the theft would hurt innocent people, including my mother and my father's other clients. How long did you keep this information to yourself? 3 years. During that time, did you see evidence that the Morrison family was struggling financially? I described Mrs. Morrison's multiple jobs, Sarah's community college compromise, the family's eventual foreclosure. With each detail, I watched Dad's shoulders slump further. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a disgruntled daughter with incomplete understanding of complex legal procedures. He suggested I'd misinterpreted routine fund transfers and acted impulsively out of family resentment. Isn't it true you felt overlooked in your family? He asked. Yes. And isn't it possible that feeling colored your interpretation of documents you weren't trained to understand? I looked directly at my father before answering. I understood that $200,000 disappeared from a widow's settlement and appeared in my family's personal accounts. I understood that my college fund was paid for with stolen money. Training doesn't change theft into legitimate business practice. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Jake wasn't allowed to testify due to his own pending case, but I watched him grow more agitated as the evidence mounted. When they played recordings of phone conversations between him and Dad discussing damage control, he finally looked at me with something like hatred. During a recess, Jake cornered me in the hallway. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You got what you wanted. Dad's finished, I'm probably disbarred, and Mom's on antidepressants. Happy now? I'm not happy about any of this, but I'm not sorry either. He's your father, Emma. This will destroy him. He destroyed himself. I just stopped helping him hide it." Jake stared at me like I was a stranger. "You used to understand loyalty. I used to confuse loyalty with complicity. Now I know the difference." The panel deliberated for an hour before returning with their decision. Dad's license was revoked. Jake faced a 3-year suspension, and both would pay substantial fines to the Client Protection Fund. As the room emptied, Dad approached me slowly. Up close, I could see how much this had cost him. His hands shook slightly, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Emma, I know you think you did the right thing, but you have no idea what you've taken from this family. I know exactly what I've taken, I said calmly. Your ability to hurt people without consequences. He looked like he wanted to say more, but something in my expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded once and walked away. Outside the courthouse, I called Marcus from the steps. How do you feel? He asked. I considered the question seriously. Clean, I said finally. Like I finally stopped carrying weight that was never mine to begin with. The girl who'd sat at that dinner table 9 months ago wouldn't have recognized the woman standing on these courthouse steps. That girl had been invisible, silenced, convinced her voice didn't matter. This woman knew better. 2 years later, I'm hosting my first dinner party in my real apartment. Not the studio, but a 1-bedroom place with actual sunlight and room for a dining table that seats 6. The smell of garlic and herbs fills the air as I put finishing touches on the meal I've been planning for weeks. Marcus arrives first, carrying flowers and the good wine we've been saving for a special occasion. Sarah Morrison comes next, now a senior at State University studying social work like me. Dr. Martinez from the hospital brings homemade bread, and my study group friends complete the circle. As we sit around the table sharing stories and laughing over pasta, I'm struck by how natural this feels. These people know my history, my struggles, my growth. They're here because they want to be, not because obligation or guilt compels them. The conversation flows freely, with everyone's voice mattering equally. Remember when you first started volunteering at the crisis center? Sarah asks. You were so nervous about giving advice to families in crisis. I smile, thinking about how far I've come. My work with victims of financial abuse has become my calling. I help people navigate the aftermath of betrayal, showing them it's possible to rebuild from nothing. Every family I help heal helps heal something in me, too. It's funny, Marcus says, raising his glass. Emma always talks about finding her voice, but I think she had it all along. She just needed the right people to listen. The toast makes me emotional in the best way. These people see me, value me, celebrate my existence instead of tolerating it. This table represents everything my family dinner table never was. Safe, supportive, genuine. After everyone leaves and Marcus helps me clean up, we sit on my couch with the last of the wine, comfortable in the quiet. Do you ever miss them? He asks. Your family? I consider the question seriously. I miss the idea of them. The family I thought we could be if I just tried harder, gave more, stayed smaller. But I don't miss who they actually were. Any regrets about that night? None. The certainty in my voice surprises me. Do you want to know what I actually said? The 3 sentences that changed everything? Marcus nods, and I take a breath, remembering that moment with perfect clarity. I said, Dad embezzled $200,000 from the Morrison family's wrongful death settlement. Jake knew about it and helped cover it up. Mrs. Morrison's daughter couldn't afford college because you stole her dead father's money. Simple truth, Marcus observes. The simplest. No accusations, no drama. Just facts they couldn't deny or twist. I curl up against his shoulder, grateful for his steady presence in my transformed life. Turns out the truth really does set you free, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Looking around my apartment at the photos from tonight, the books from my graduate program, the thank you cards from families I've helped, I realize I've built something better than what I lost. I've created a life where being seen and valued isn't something I have to earn through silence or sacrifice. The girl who tapped her fork against that wine glass was brave enough to speak her truth. The woman sitting here tonight was wise enough to build a new life on that foundation. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to carry other people's shame. Sometimes loving yourself means disappointing people who never really loved you anyway. And sometimes 3 honest sentences are all it takes to transform invisible into invincible. I'm Emma, and I finally matter. Not because someone else decided I do, but because I decided I always did.